Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's November 1st, 2020, and as promised, today we're delivering another podcast focused on the 2020 elections, which are a mere week away. We're speaking with Thant and Ben Dunant. Ben is managing editor at Frontier Myanmar, and Sumon is an independent researcher and election observer with over a decade of experience at numerous well-known civil society organisations in Myanmar. So, hello Sumon and hello Ben.
Hello Luke.
Hey Luke, it's good to be back.
It's great to have you both here, and I'm really excited for this episode. So I'll just jump in with a little bit of exposition. So since 2015, the incumbent National League for Democracy, or NLD, civilian government, has struggled to provide structural reform of key institutions, such as the military and the judiciary. They've failed to repeal repressive laws that curtail freedom of expression, association and assembly. They've made only little progress on the root causes of decades-long armed conflict, and they haven't been able to end the discrimination and violent persecution of Myanmar's ethnic and religious minorities. The role of civil society continues to be undermined, federal rights of ethnic nationalities aren't really being recognised, and democratic space in Myanmar remains restricted to the provisions of the military-drafted 2008 constitution, under which 25% of seats in Parliament are reserved for the military. But despite all of that, or perhaps because of all of that, the NLD is almost certain to win another term of government in a week's time. So let's begin with the institutional context for the elections before we move on to focus on parties and campaigning. I'll keep the first question really simple. We're a week away, which means most of the at least institutional limitations are kind of likely to be baked in. So from that perspective, the question is, will the 2020 elections likely be free and fair?
Yes, Luke. So I would say the elections feel like a backward step compared to the polls that we had 5 years ago that were also flawed, but were overwhelmingly accepted in the country and outside. But that question of whether it's free and fair sort of implies that there's a kind of threshold beyond which an election becomes free and fair. And then you get into a conversation about whether you should recognize the results or not. And if you look at it that way, then you could ask, once the results are in, will there be a new government that has a genuine popular mandate? And then I think if, as expected, the NLD does win again, I think it would be very hard for anyone to say that government doesn't have a popular mandate, and in fact has a pretty strong popular mandate. It would be hard to say that that is not what the majority want. Now, that's an outcome which would be quite hard to say of Thailand or Cambodia or really most countries in Southeast Asia. However, just to reframe it a little bit, while that government would have a strong popular mandate, it would not be an inclusive mandate. Because the election is a winner-takes-all system, it means, for instance, that even if ethnic minority parties do very well, it's very hard for them to then be represented in the government, either at the national level or the subnational level. And I think we can go into the detail later about why it is a winner-takes-all system. But it does produce an outcome in which the majority gets what it wants, but minority interests aren't really represented. And that's a problem for the peace process. It's a problem for intercommunal harmony. And so that's one thing. The result will be a democratic outcome, but it will be a fairly narrow one. And then the other problems, procedural ones, with the way that the Union Election Commission has acquitted itself, the fact that it hasn't been transparent, it hasn't been communicating well with stakeholders, the fact that it has a credibility problem, that the commission is entirely appointed by the president, so effectively by the ruling party. And we've seen that, for instance, with the announcements of huge amounts of cancellations in Rakhine State, where now most of the state will not be able to vote. And this has caused a huge outcry. Now, while voting is objectively unsafe in many parts of Rakhine, the question is that the case in all the places where polling was cancelled? But because the Election Commission's decision-making was very opaque, it didn't really explain itself very well, that obviously leads to suspicions that while some of the cancellation decisions were legitimate, there might have been some gerrymandering around the edges. Because if you look at the outcome of the cancellations, it's very, very convenient for the ruling party, the National League for Democracy, and it really, really hurts the ethnic Rakhine parties whose core constituencies in the center and north of the state have basically been taken away and will only be subject to by-elections, which will be in early 2022 at the earliest. And I think what concerns me isn't so much whether the election is either free or fair is not. It's the fact that we seem to have moved backwards in many ways from 2015. And a lot of these institutions involved in running elections and the institution of elections themselves are very young in their development. What I worry is that a lot of the mistakes and backsliding now could end up being baked into the process. And I think just the fact that we've moved backwards from 2015 and what is in terms of the country's development only a short number of years is sort of very, very concerning. And I think at least having gradual improvement in the course of each electoral cycle is very important. So I think that the flaws of the election carry with it concerns and warning signs for the future democratic development of the country.
If we talk about institutional limitations on free and fair elections, there are two, one vested in the Constitution and one vested with the Union Election Commission. The electoral legal framework is in fact drawn from the Constitution. So, for instance, it prescribes who are eligible to vote or run as candidates which are not entirely democratic or fair. Also, designation of electoral constituency is based on administrative boundaries and not on the population. This creates huge malapportionment and unfair political representation in the Union Parliament because each elected MP in the Union Parliament will later be given equal amount of constituency development fund. Then there's a huge difference in the number of population that each MP has to cover using the same amount of money. This is, of course, impacting the campaigning capacity of each candidate. Even if we leave geographical and public transportation challenges out of the equation, each candidate has to cover different proportion of population for a vote. There is a huge imbalance voting power, so for some candidates, they may need to reach out to only thousands of voters, but for others, they may need to reach out to hundreds of thousands of voters to win a seat. Regarding the UEC, I agree with what Ben said about backwards in electoral management. Although the Union Election Commission is appointed by the government, it doesn't necessarily have to have allegiance to the government. It could have kept some distance and acted independently. I mean, it was possible for previous commissions, so this commission could have made informed decisions for cancellations of elections in some areas. It could have consulted with electoral stakeholders or received their support for any changes to bylaws. It could have considered recommendations from observers for reform. It could have communicated better with media and voters so that the elections conduct could be peaceful, acceptable, and legitimate, even if it were not entirely free and fair due to institutional limitations.
All right, so given there are all of these operational weaknesses and that the Union Election Commission seems to be failing in its mission to be impartial, is there anyone who isn't disappointed with the UEC this time around?
Well, you don't hear many complaints from the ruling party or their supporters because the decisions that the UEC has made tend to be pretty convenient for the ruling party. One was a notification that came at the beginning of August that basically allowed union ministers to campaign early. And because most union ministers are from the NLD, that obviously helped the NLD. But also, for instance, the cancellations of polling in certain parts of the country have basically benefited the NLD, whether intentionally or not. And so for that reason, I've not heard really many criticisms coming from the NLD camp, which is obviously a huge political camp. I don't know if you've heard otherwise, Simon. I mean, there's been a huge amount of criticism from opposition parties, for instance, who feel very frustrated, for instance, that the UEC doesn't really communicate with them, doesn't really take on board their concerns. And just speaking from the media perspective, there's been a lot of frustration, this UEC is much harder to reach, much harder to engage with. That applies not only at the union level, but also at the local level too. Colleagues have found when they go to township election subcommissions or subcommissions at the district level, they often just don't want to share, extremely basic information that should be in the public domain anyway. And that's been another kind of backward step.
Yes, Ben, opposition party criticized the UEC a lot, but I do not see any official statement or complaints made by the ruling party compared to 2015 when the NLD issued multiple statements regarding the decisions made by the Commission of 2015. Plus, the current Commission and the NLD share similar view or have one voice in multiple cases. For example, opposition parties wanted to add a clause in political parties' code of conduct that would basically limit the use of the image of General Aung San in election campaigns, who is the father of Aung San Suu Kyi and national leader and independence hero. This was objected by the NLD and the UEC. In other cases, political parties call for the election postponement due to the high cases of COVID. But these calls were also rejected by the UEC. The reasoning they gave is because other countries also held elections successfully despite COVID. This view was actually shared by the NLD, and even the choice of the countries they gave as examples are the same, which are Singapore and South Korea. So in some cases, the UEC seems to be waiting the signals from the government. For instance, the state councillor gave a speech on TV that senior citizens who are over the age of 60 will be allowed to vote in advance before the Union Election Commission officially announced that. The only time I heard NLD complaints was when there were open envelopes or ballot papers during overseas voting, because overseas voting can generally be translated into the vote for the NLD, just like the military voting can be translated into the vote for the USDP. But even the complaints are not made officially. They are more like individual concerns and requests.
That's great. Terrific. It's given us a really good overview of how the institutions in Myanmar's electoral process are affecting the integrity of the upcoming elections. But on the day itself, there's been a really concerning uptick in violence, election-related violence in the last few weeks, mostly between NLD and USDP supporters. And this has even resulted in a death and in civil servants being shot at as they try to set up and deliver polling materials. So what is driving this, and is it likely to spill over to violence on election day?
Right, we have seen more reports of clashes, fight and riot, mainly between the supporters of two major parties compared to 2015. When I talked to some parties, they also mentioned that they witnessed more incidents this year. Destroying the billboards of candidates and political parties isn't a new thing. There were a few incidents of that in 2015, but only a few parties were targeted in a particular area, so we can have a general idea of who might be behind. But now the attacks were so random, and almost every party, the NLD, the USDP, and other oppositions, experienced this sort of obstruction and interference. This could also be related to the restrictional movement for a very long time and other COVID measures. There are some research that suggests a correlation between COVID consequences and electoral violence, as it is harder to identify those who commit, but for them it is easier to get away. The rule of law is particularly weak during pandemic, etc. Many people are stuck at home and have so much free time and energy, which there is nowhere to spend because schools and businesses are closed. So I think this gives them a chance to participate in campaigns for fun and some incentives.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about how people have been cooped up for a long time, and suddenly they're able to go out on the campaign trail. And even if there isn't violence, I mean, there's been some pretty wild videos from the campaign trail in various parts of the country, where even if people aren't fighting, like they're going nuts, they're dancing everywhere, they're playing very loud music. Now, that is not happening in Yangon because of the citywide lockdown. So you're getting some cars kind of going around playing party tunes, but really this kind of very boisterous campaigning, which is also where violence is happening elsewhere in the country. A lot of the fighting, which has claimed one life in the Sagaing region, is basically confined to NLD USDP rivalry in the dry zone, basically. So actually also in Ayeyarwady as well. So you could say in the Burma heartland, and USDP NLD rivalry, that seems to be the venue where this is taking place. I mean, my speculation is that the USDP is in a very weak position and is struggling for support many areas of the country, and is often left to recruit some quite unsavory characters to campaign for it, some like petty criminals and so on, because most of the violence is coming from the USDP supporters. But that is speculation on my part. I don't really know who these people are on the USDP team who seem to be kind of picking a lot of these fights on purpose.
There's also a huge social divide. What I have seen from some evidence of incidents, it shows the strong feelings of these supporters have towards each other. There are no real venues for people to connect, discuss, debate, and build trust. These supporters clash either on the ground during the campaign or on social media, where they only spread hate speech and insults. There is no facilitation by any third party. This also shows the weaknesses of dispute resolution mechanism. The UEC form election mediation committees at the various levels with party representatives, aside from the formal mechanism that you can make official complaint for scrutiny or charge at the polling station. But these committees are not properly enforced nor well functioning. None of them can handle these issues properly, unfortunately.
Before we leave the UEC, you've brought them up again. So can I ask, has there been anything encouraging about the way that the UEC has acquitted itself for these 2020 elections, or has it all been bad news for the deepening of democracy in Myanmar?
Well, the real headline reform is to military voting. I mean, all over Myanmar, there are these very large military cantonments where lots of soldiers live with their families. And in last elections, polling stations have been hosted inside these cantonments. However, now, according to a bylaw change that happened earlier this year in Parliament, polling stations will now all or mostly, I think with some exceptions, be outside a military cantonment. So soldiers and their families will either be voting sort of shoulder to shoulder or 6 feet apart or whatever from civilian voters, or they will just be in their own dedicated polling stations for soldiers and their families that will nonetheless be outside a military cantonment. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether that really works. I'm quite skeptical that will really make the voting process that much more free, just because I think, the problem is that it's just a vote bank for the USDP in a way that doesn't look very credible. And it'll be interesting to see whether, there's a much more kind of like plural and like natural looking distribution of votes at polling stations, because votes are counted at the polling station level. So you should be able to see that. However, this reform does leave advanced voting unaddressed, which is the truly opaque aspect of military voting. When soldiers deploy to other parts of the country, for a few months, say, then they can cast an out of constituency advance vote, and that process is completely non-transparent. Advance voting was a very high proportion of the military vote in quite a lot of townships where there's a large military population, and this was, impossible to observe and was not even overseen by the UEC. So that's still a big fraud risk that I think hasn't really been addressed. The other thing I like to say in the UEC's favor, though, is although you could question their wisdom in proceeding with the election now, while parts of the country are suffering big outbreaks of COVID-19, they have allowed over 60 people aged over 60s in lockdown townships vote early. And we've seen scenes recently in Yangon of people from the subcommissions going with mobile polling stations and basically going door to door and setting up little polling stations on the streets and sort of asking all the old people to come out, or even kind of going to their doors with the ballots. And so far, this process seems to be working pretty well, and is probably helping a lot more old people to vote who would otherwise probably just not want to risk going to the polling station on election day. I don't know what you've seen, Sumon, but people seem to be pretty happy with it. I've heard from Burmese friends, saying, I was so worried about my grandpa going to vote on election day, but he really wanted to vote. But now, someone came to his door and he was able to do it at home. And that's a big relief.
I have a few comments on those points. Regarding the military voting, the primary motive is to expose the military personnel then to have a free and transparent electoral process, or to channel the votes for the NLD, but to get a sense of how many military personnel are actually in each compound due to limited access of military information. For instance, MPs cannot scrutinize the military budget in the parliament, how much for salaries, how much for neutrals, due to National Secret Act, so this is a motive beyond the electoral context. Regarding the advance voting, it is impressive that the UEC adopted some procedures to ensure the right to vote for senior citizens and the people in quarantine, but these ad hoc measures compromise the level playing field because the campaign period is until November 6, and you could see ongoing party campaigns are happening near the advance voting. If not asking openly to vote for a particular party, then there are a lot of visible signs for you to vote for a particular party, because supporters around are holding flags, using posters and stickers, wearing t-shirts, etc. And the mobile advance voting compromises the secret voting of the voters, as there is no proper private booth for voting, and there are crowds around and helpers around. Brancher gave credit to this commission for its commitment to hold regular elections and institutionalize democratic transitions, despite a lot of pressures. Whether these decisions are justified or inclusive is a whole different story. The other development would be the UEC's digital presence. They have become more active on social media, communicate directly with the voters using short videos, songs, infographics, illustrations, rather than indirectly communicating through parties, CSOs, and media like prior commission. Again, I'm not sure this is a good or bad thing in terms of the impact.
We've touched on the potential for violence on election day and the violence that's been happening during the campaign between supporters of the major parties. But of course, Myanmar still has a lot of more entrenched, more serious kinds of conflicts. And when we talk about conflict and election, we're often thinking about where voting can take place, because in 2015, there were several areas that voting could not take place as it was deemed unsafe. So in the 2020 elections, where will voting take place, not take place? And are people in areas that could not vote in 2015 being able to vote in 2020?
Yes, I referred to the cancellations earlier in terms of how UEC's decision-making has not been transparent and has also tended to benefit the NLD, and how that has raised huge suspicions from opposition parties. But I think it's important to state that the really big effect of the cancellations that were announced on October 16th was the Rakhine State disenfranchisement, where it was more than 1 million voters there. And while large parts of Rakhine are undeniably insecure, and I know at Frontier, a lot of our reporting from Rakhine State was about how village tract administrators who, play an essential role in administering, the voter list and polling stations, had basically run away from their posts. Many villages had simply been depopulated because of conflict and so on. Although some of those cancellations were for legitimate security reasons, they were so widespread in Rakhine, including urban areas that are, secured by the Tatmadaw, where the necessary government infrastructure is in place. So that does raise a huge amount of questions, and the UEC hasn't really explained itself on that one. But I think it's important to say that outside of Rakhine State, there are fewer wards and village tracts in parts of the country outside of Rakhine compared to 2015. In Kayin State, for instance, there is about half the number of village tracts that have been cancelled this time compared to last time. And that has been credited to increased cooperation between the government and the Karen National Union, which is the main ethnic armed group in that state. And that's quite interesting because that is, in Kayin State, you have seen some recent violence, and it seems to be linked to particular brigades of KNU. And in those areas where the fighting has happened, the election is still cancelled. But in other parts of Kayin State, you're seeing quite large rural areas that could not vote in 2015 that can vote now. So that's an interesting kind of counter picture. But overall, outside of Rakhine, there are fewer wards and village tracts that are cancelled. However, it's hard to say about population because this time a few urban areas of Shan State were also cancelled. So I can't say for sure whether outside of Rakhine fewer people were disenfranchised this time. But I think there are other impacts that conflict has. One is campaign space, particularly in northern Shan State. A lot of the armed groups there have grown in size. So like the Ta'ang National Liberation Army has recruited many more members compared to 2015. The Federation Council of Shan State has been recruiting a lot. It has expanded its territory in northern Shan. And because of that, ethnic armed group recruitment and expansion, the Tatmadaw in turn has increased its presence. So that area of northern Shan is much more militarized. And from Frontier reporters, we've heard from candidates about how that has really constrained their campaign space, that even in areas where the election is going ahead, where there are no cancellations, they don't feel very free to campaign, and or they say that they're actually being blocked by ethnic armed groups. Now these examples are isolated, but they are happening. That nonetheless is a factor in how credible and open the elections are in conflict areas outside of Rakhine.
That's a really great, thorough answer. Anything to add, Suman?
That covers it pretty well. This is one place where the UEC can be improved. Election observers constantly providing a recommendation to the UEC to be accountable, transparent, and inclusive in decision-making regarding elections cancellation, and of course to state these conditions and procedures clearly in legal framework.
Let's talk a little bit about the electoral system now. So a spokesperson for the Tatmadaw has proposed changing Myanmar's electoral system from first past the post to proportional representation as a solution to what they call an ongoing political crisis. Why is Myanmar's electoral system first past the post, and what would changing it solve, if anything? And then why is the Tatmadaw suggesting this change and not the USDP? Has the USDP suggested this before?
I mean, the first past the post system is the system that Myanmar has always had from the elections of the 1950s and 1960, for instance. It's like kind of a colonial inheritance. So it was kind of the default setting, and I don't think there's ever really been a sort of period of reform or reflection, to see whether this is really the best system. I mean, it's a system in which the NLD does particularly well. For instance, I think in 2015 it won about 56% of the popular vote, but it ended up with almost 80% of the seat. So they obviously have a huge vested interest in keeping a first past the post system. Now, when it comes to who are the winners and losers of that system, I think with ethnic parties, it's a bit ambiguous, because a lot of ethnic parties do rely on quite concentrated ethnic populations, but it's clear that there's one party in particular that would do much better under a proportional representation system, and that is the USDP, because they got, I think, almost 30% of the popular vote in 2015, but because of the harshness of the first past the post system, they were left with about, was it 8% or 5% of seats? So they are hugely disadvantaged. So even, they will possibly do even less well in this election. So the interests are quite clearly in line. But perhaps, Simon, you can talk about analysis of how ethnic parties in particular would do under different electoral systems, because for me, it seems a little bit unclear whether most of them really would do better under PR.
USDP did suggest the electoral system change in 2014 and again in 2017. There were debates among parties and in the parliament in 2014, but ethnic parties are the ones who strongly oppose the system change, as they are the major parties in their stronghold and do not want to share the seat with smaller ethnic parties. The military now suggests PR. Let's just remind ourselves that military got 25% in every parliament. If none of the parties win the majority, then the military will be the one who benefits the most from the PR system. And remember that 34 political parties met with the military commander-in-chief and discussed many issues. And one of them is related to switching the electoral system to PR. The commander-in-chief made a comment about that one-party system is not good for the country in different occasions. It seems that military is taking the political road that USDP cannot, and making the move to build trust and alliance with ethnic parties. Meanwhile, the USDP is trying to keep distance from ethnic parties, if it helps the reputation of ethnic parties. For instance, the old party issued a statement and said they are no longer the USDP alliance. To me, this is a collaborative act or a new strategy of the USDP and the military.
So I think we both concluded that, these different parties and entities' positions on first past the post versus proportional representation system is mostly a question of rational self-interest. And for that reason, I think any electoral reform is very unlikely to happen. For the reason that it's unlikely to happen in most countries, really, is that, it seems likely that the NLD will lead the next government. Most parties that win under a particular system don't want to change that system because it benefits them. And in this case, it very clearly benefits the NLD. So I think, and it's impossible to imagine this reform happening without their say-so. So I think any kind of electoral reform really, I think, is going to be very hard for the reasons that we both described.
Yeah, I agree. In reality, it is not impossible, but it could be difficult. Voters, they got confused how to vote, how many to vote. Let's be fair, if a voter voted since 2010, then they voted only twice in their life. And not all of them are interested in politics and ready to learn new things. There were many invalid votes in the previous election. What I'm trying to say is that the FPTP system is the easiest, and we still need a lot of voter education programs. It would be even harder to replace with a more complicated system. We might end up having many invalid votes if the system change is not properly discussed or introduced in a rush.
So there is a common sense logic and there is a lot of hope that as civilian rule is extended in the government system of Myanmar, And as the institutionalization of democracy in Myanmar deepens, this will help lead to less conflict, not more. But does the winner-takes-all system in Myanmar and the example of Rakhine State since 2010 somewhat problematize this logic?
I think, unfortunately, because of the winner-takes-all nature of the system, it's almost inevitable that, it creates very strong winners and very strong losers. And right now, and I think that Sumon can attest to this with her research on ethnic political parties and how they've merged. I mean, there's really a lot of enthusiasm behind these new ethnic parties in different states, like in Kachin State with the KSPP. Among our activists, among youths, there's a lot of enthusiasm there. In KR State with the new Unified KR Party there. And I think they're likely to be disappointed either if, as may happen, the parties don't do as well as expected, or if they do well, but then because of the structure of the government and the way the president is chosen, they don't get any power after that. For instance, in Rakhine State, Rakhine parties won majority of elected seats in the Rakhine State Parliament in 2010 and 2015, but they still had state governments imposed of them by the ruling party of the day. So, USDP in 2011 and NLD in 2016 when the new governments were formed in those years. And this is kind of a recipe for, continued disillusionment, really. And it's easy to see, people becoming incredibly jaded, the people who supported this, unified Kachin party now, for instance, in Kachin State, being sort of jubilant, they win lots of seats, but then, there's going to be a pretty bad hangover if they find that that doesn't actually mean that their party will actually be granted much power. However, although this is a recipe for armed conflict because all these states have a long history of armed insurgency, that is always an option. And that's one that just may become more attractive still. However, it is within the ruling party's power to rectify a lot of this. I mean, the constitution basically gives them all the discretion to make appointments, including at the subnational level. I mean, then it could use this to build bridges, because although the constitution gives the NLD, for instance, if they win the election, the right to appoint, an NLD person to the chief minister of Kachin State, even if the NLD does bad there, like it doesn't have to do that. Like it can, observe the ethnic party that does well there, and then, in a bridge building gesture, say, we are going to choose someone from the victorious local party to be the chief minister of that state, or they could let the state parliament have a vote, for instance. I mean, it's not written in the constitution, but the NLD, the new president, probably from the NLD, would have the power to do that. And that would be a very powerful symbol, and, it would be entirely within their power to do that. And I hope that there will be these kind of gestures, and I think that would go some way to kind of rectify the kind of alienation that is built into a winner-takes-all electoral system. But we'll see, really.
In fact, there is an opposite trend, the one moving towards electoral politics and the one moving from electoral politics. In this 2020 elections, you can see parties that are transformed from militias are contesting. Public figures and civil society leaders are also competing, and even a few leaders from well-respected EOs are contesting as party candidates. So if you look at this trend, there is a hope for democratic transition and less conflicts. But on the other hand, there is a distrust in democratic institutions. There were no-vote campaigns a couple of months ago that stem from lack of trust in the electoral system, political representation for diverse groups, the election management. But Rakhine case is a bit more complicated as it involves nationalism and intercommunal conflicts, in addition to wanting for self-autonomy and ethnic equality. These issues should be able to discuss in peace dialogues or in parliaments, but absence of these avenues is a major problem. So this goes back to your question, Luke. If there is a political will, then there are many institutions we can consider in order to accommodate the diverse interests we may not need to change the FBTB system entirely. Instead, we can just add some quota system to it, or we can just use the mix system or a greater political decentralization to make these democratic institutions work. This election is very hard for us to know which trend is surpassing which, but we know right after the elections if those democratic institutions cannot act as a venue to solve political problems.
All right. And Ben mentioned earlier your work, Simone, on party mergers. So how is the field of parties in contention different in 2020 compared to 2015? And what have the trends been, say, over the last 5 years? Are voters confronted with very similar options in 2020, or are they confronted with very different options compared to 2015 when they fill out their vote?
We need to revisit the main feature of 2015 political competition. In 2015, it was a two-party competition, mainly between the NLD and the USDP, which also reflected the competition between pro-military and pro-democracy groups. The NLD said it is time for change, and people voted accordingly. Third parties, either ethnic-based or state-based, were not an option. CSO across the country supported and campaigned for the NLD. EOs endorsed the NLD. If we look at the interviews of third-party leaders who are neither NLD or USDP, they said they are happy with the NLD achievement and no other way. But this time, the political competition remains the same in the regions where Burma majority mostly live, but in ethnic states, the game is changed. The main rival for the NLD is no longer the USDP, but state-based ethnic parties who now enjoy a lot of support from local communities, influential actors such as religious or ethnic leaders and CSO. These parties were defeated by the NLD in 2015 due to the widespread support of locals for the NLD and due to the electoral system. So to win the heart of the locals and to react the electoral system, parties based in at least 5 ethnic states either merged or found an alliance to compete against the NLD. The 2020 competition also reflects the competition between Burma one-party rule and multi-ethnic rule. Also, if you look at the campaign promises, there is a huge focus on federalism and ethnic rights for this election, if this makes any indication of this competition.
Okay, and then is the NLD that is in contention in 2020 the same party that it was in 2015? And the same goes for the USDP. Have there been any major policy shifts or personality shifts in the last 5 years?
In the NLD, it is hard to discern any change in their platform. I mean, I recently read the new NLD manifesto. It is very, very similar to the 2015 manifesto. I mean, there are a few more buzzwords like sustainable development that have been added because, you know, the last 5 years, it's released a sustainable development plan for the country. But I think substantively, it's hard to discern any policy change. It's still the same very kind of vague promises of federal democracy. A lot of their campaigning is centered around the personality of Aung San Suu Kyi. And the platform that it's giving to voters is more or less sort of, we need more time to deliver the promises that we made to you 5 years ago. Like, that's my take on the NLD. My take on the USDP is that they didn't really have a coherent platform at all in 2015. I mean, they were often running on their development record in government, and they obviously can't really do that now because they've not been in government. I noticed that the last 5 years, they've tried to be more of like a conventionally right-wing party, you could say, that it's come out with some fairly ultra-nationalist statements about, you know, defending the borders, fighting the national races, those kind of saber-rattling statements. It's come out with those in relation to Rakhine and other issues. And it's got a few fairly small allied parties that tend to sign on to those statements. But none of those positions really seem to have caught much traction, really. I mean, when they've held rallies, for instance, it's generally people who sort of look like they've been paid to be there, and it seems like they've not really been able to kind of present a coherent kind of alternative vision or really make any kind of nationalist dog whistles that have really caught on in the public's imagination. The USDP are kind of all over the place in this election, and I think ultimately in the public's mind they're sort of associated with the past days of military rule, and that's a very hard legacy for the party to shrug off, and I'm not sure it really can. I mean, it would need a pretty big reinvention to shrug off that toxic legacy, and it's questionable whether it can really do that. But I'd be interested to hear Sumon's take on those parties.
I agree with you, Ben. There is no major policy shift that I'm aware of. Both are very general in their approaches to economics and politics, but of course the USDP as a right-wing party, so they use the language that would reflect its positions. For instance, if the NLD said it will work towards a democratic federal union, and the message of the USDP would be the same, a democratic federal union, but with a national spirit. The NLD now seems a bit down to the earth that it does not give promises that cannot fulfill, like in 2015. The other opposition parties present more specific policy positions in that case.
All right, let's talk about COVID-19. So if my maths is correct, there's now been over 1,200 officially counted deaths and many more gone uncounted in Myanmar. The wave of cases and deaths is radiating out from Yangon, and even over 200 medical workers at the Yangon General Hospital have tested positive. Now, supporters of both major parties, the National League for Democracy and the USDP, have flouted public health guidelines, as you mentioned earlier, Ben, aimed at containing the spread of the virus. So I want to know, has this been at all linked directly or endorsed by either of the major parties? Or are these events just the work of enthusiastic supporters putting politics above public health?
We can look at it positively and say this is the work of enthusiastic supporters, but because the party would not admit any connection or endorsement somehow. But this is too good to be true. The massive campaigns cost money. If we do the math, thousands of people and vehicles combined, even for one full-day campaign trail, that would cost 1 or 2 million jets. Let's look at our economy and income, particularly during COVID time, where majority of businesses are either closed down or running under budget. A candidate can use up to 10 million jets for campaigns according to the law. To me, this type of campaign that shows support for the party is one way of avoiding for candidates to keep their expenses under the campaign finance ceiling.
Yeah, I thought that was really well put. I hadn't really thought about the campaign finance implications because the campaign finance regulations are pretty slim, and they make most political finance a black box, and there's not a lot of scrutiny of how money is spent. You don't really have to reveal who your donors are. There's kind of a loophole in that there's this sort of fuzzy distinction between party financing and candidate financing. That makes it easy for a party to put on a party event, obviously to promote its candidates in the election, but they can say that that is a party event and does not count towards the campaign spending limit that would apply to an individual candidate. And that's an area where reform would be hugely important. There really hasn't been, as far as I am aware, any significant reform of campaign finance over the last 5 years. And I would urge anyone to read Jared McCarthy's essay, Class Dismissed, because that makes a very good case for why the current campaign finance regime does corrupt politics. It makes parties and candidates very beholden to anonymous private donors, and can skew things like the way that land disputes are resolved and so on. So I think there's not space really in this podcast left to discuss all the implications of that, but I suggest that for further reading.
Okay, and that touches on the major parties, but how about the dozens of minor parties? How have they adjusted their campaigning due to the COVID-19 restrictions? I am guessing they can't get away with the same kinds of things.
It depends on where they are. Remember, only Yangon and Rakhine are the most COVID-affected areas, and the rest of the country, the minor parties can campaign relatively freely. Minor parties based in Yangon shift their campaign online and have more digital presence than on the ground. Facebook is the main platform for discussions and outreach, where they share the candidate info, party policy, promises, campaign song, campaign slogans. Other minor parties in ethnic areas, they campaign in conventional way, small meetings, door-to-door, distributing pamphlets, etc. But public rallies and mass gatherings are not possible anywhere. But minor parties in ethnic states, they can do small meetups with up to 50 people and 2 or 3 times per day to reach the target. There are other areas with no internet or COVID at all, like in remote areas of northern Shan State. For them, they have to adjust their campaign plans according to the address that might be operating in their area.
And has COVID-19 yet become an explicit election issue? If so, how is it being politicized?
It happens online, on social media, among the supporters. Lobbies compare the Nagis government and the COVID government and ask to vote based on their performances. Before this, the different groups trying to take advantage to use COVID as an excuse. The MPs proposed in the parliament to get the military on board in response to COVID crisis. Some suggest the government to call National Defense and Security Council, both aiming to increase the military involvement. And some MPs and officials use the government aid to improve their personal profile or party's image.
There hasn't really been a debate between different parties over how to handle the pandemic. No opposition parties have really been able to put a coherent alternative plan for the pandemic. In many other countries, including in the US, which is also about to have its big election very soon, it's a huge kind of partisan issue with the different parties presenting very, very different plans. And at least I'm not seeing that here. Like, I'm not seeing anyone really fundamentally criticizing the government's approach, being like, well, if we were in power, we would do this, like we would go harder or we would go softer.
Opposition parties did push the government to present the plans for COVID-affected households and communities, but this also coincides with the election time, so their attention is moved to the calls for election postponements instead of politicizing COVID for campaigns.
And then, has COVID-19 affected early voting abroad or in Myanmar? And how do you think COVID-19 is going to affect the turnout on election day?
Well, apparently, overseas voting is much greater this year than 5 years ago. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but I think it's considerably more people. And it seems to be because just the process has matured more and more people were registered to vote overseas. So that's been a kind of unspoken success. I mean, it still leaves a huge amount of overseas migrants in Thailand, for instance, or in Malaysia, and seems to be much more successful in countries like Singapore and Japan, where I suppose the populations are probably more concentrated to begin with. As to turnout, I don't know. That's a really good question because there's very little precedent to go on. I mean, I would assume that turnout would be reasonably good without COVID, but with COVID, I don't know. I honestly don't know what to expect there.
Expecting more or less the same voter turnout in other states and regions except for Yangon and Rakhine. In Rakhine, elections are cancelled in 34 constituencies so that over 1 million voters are already disfranchised. I do not think COVID would have a huge impact on voter turnout. I mean, the pre-election survey done by the People Alliance for Credible Elections, it shows that only 50% made up their mind to vote, and the rest are still not sure for many other reasons. The overseas voting turnout is quite high, according to the UEC, which over 70%, 80% around the range. The UEC also increased the number of days for voting, so people can take the day off from their work and come for the vote. But the voter turnout is not the most important thing here because it is calculated based on the eligible voters. There are many people who are eligible but not on the voter list. For instance, many people abroad registered to vote, but not all of them were approved. Only like 40% or 50% were registered as eligible. So half of them were not able to vote, and the majority of the other half showed up. And it is the same for the domestic migrants. For example, those who live and work in Yangon and who cannot go back to check their voter list in their resident area or go through the documentation because the process is difficult and cumbersome, which they can't be bothered. So there will be many people who are not on the voter list because of the management or the COVID. So now we have 38 million eligible voters. I'm sure there are many more and many people are disenfranchised, even if the voter turnout would be okay.
Now, in 2015, there were many organisations observing the elections. Has COVID-19 affected election observation in 2020? Who should we look out for in the media for a judgment on the integrity of these elections?
We have 3 international observation missions here, and for Regional Observer, the United States-based Carter Center, and the EU Expert Mission. There are 12 domestic groups approved by the UEC. So in terms of the quantity, it is not a huge decline, as we had over 10,000 observers in 2015, and now we have over 8,000 observers. But in terms of the quality, observers cannot operate freely as well, and so they cannot cover many aspects of the elections, for example, like campaign speeches, advance voting, due to COVID restrictions. Other than that, we will have domestic and international observers who would assess the integrity of the elections.
Ben, you're managing editor at the leading English language media organisation in Myanmar that is also rapidly expanding all of its digital services. So will you be live blogging or working with Frontier on election day to bring results to the people?
Yeah, we're going to run a live log on election day. I mean, we had a plan to deploy people in many parts of the country. That's now not looking so good because of the travel restrictions. But, we're going to try to work on ingenious ways to overcome that. But yeah, you can expect lots of exciting coverage on frontiermyanmar.net. So make sure you log into that site on the big day and the days afterwards as the results begin to trickle in.
Thank you so much for giving us all of this time. Before we wrap up, can we just quickly give our recommendations? So this is a section of the show where you get to recommend anything to do with Myanmar to our listeners. It doesn't have to be about the elections, but it's welcome to be. So why don't we start with you, Ben?
For a bit of light relief that is nonetheless very relevant, I recommend that you look up a video that the UEC did quite recently, which is incredibly charming. And I don't know exactly who is on camera, but it looks like mid-ranking members of the UEC doing a delightful little dance to disco music, if I remember right. And it made me smile, and will probably make you smile too. And I hope, Luke, that you can include a link to this video in the show notes of the podcast.
Yeah, so you can find that video and many other hilarious ones at the Union Election Commission's Facebook page. That's Myanmar UEC, or Union Election Commission in English. The song that you're talking about, I think, is Nai Ngan Tha Da Wan. And how about you, Simone? What do you have for us?
The Carter Center recently released its second pre-election assessment report. It covers the campaign environment, electoral management, and operations. It will be interesting for those who are interested in 2020 Myanmar elections.
And that one is the Carter Center's second pre-election statement that they released on October 30th. You can get it from the website of the Carter Center. Really a huge thank you to you both. I know you're both so busy. The election's only a week away, but I really, really appreciate that you both gave us all of your time today. So thank you so much for coming on Myanmar Musings.
Thanks, Luke, for having me.
Thank you, Luke. It's been a pleasure.